Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
The air inside the restaurant was thick with the scent of garlic and roasted meat, the kind of warm, rich aroma that should have made the evening feel comfortable, inviting, even pleasant. But instead, Olivia felt the familiar knot of tension winding itself tightly in her stomach as she listened to her brother's voice cut through the conversation like a dull blade. The clinking of silverware against plates, the occasional burst of laughter from the surrounding tables, and the gentle hum of conversation did nothing to soften the sharp, smug edge in Ryan's tone as he leaned back in his chair, whirling his wine in slow, lazy circles like a man who believed he had already won a game no one else had agreed to play. "You know, Olivia," he said, stretching out her name in that familiar, condescending drawl that made her want to grit her teeth. "I've always admired how hard you try. Really, I do. But at some point, don't you ever wonder if it's worth it? I mean, you're basically a glorified assistant, aren't you?" He chuckled, shaking his head as he glanced at their father, as if expecting him to join in, as if his words were nothing more than harmless teasing between siblings instead of the deliberate, calculated insult that they truly were. For a brief second, Olivia let the words settle between them, let them sink in just deep enough to feel the weight of them press against her ribs, let herself absorb the way the conversation around them briefly paused, how their mother let out a soft sigh, barely audible over the background noise, how their father, ever the passive observer, simply cleared his throat and took another sip of his drink as if the moment had already passed. It was always like this. Ryan said whatever he wanted, masked his arrogance beneath the thin veil of playful banter, and everyone else pretended it was just another harmless joke, another meaningless jab, another moment that wasn't worth making a scene over. But tonight was different. Olivia exhaled slowly, pressing her fingers lightly against the stem of her own wine glass, feeling the cool, delicate surface beneath her fingertips as she forced herself to smile, to relax, to let Ryan believe, just for a few more moments, that he was still the one in control. She had spent years letting these moments pass, years swallowing down the irritation, the frustration, the quiet, simmering rage that came with being the sibling no one took seriously, the one everyone overlooked. The one whose successes were treated as footnotes in the grand narrative of Ryan's inevitable rise to greatness. And for years, she had let them believe that was fine, had let them believe that she was happy sitting quietly in the background, playing the role they had assigned to her without protest. But tonight, she wasn't just playing along. Tonight, she was waiting. She watched as Ryan leaned forward, setting his glass down with a small clink against the table, his smirk widening as he studied her expression, waiting for the inevitable flustered response, the defensive explanation, the awkward laugh that would let him know he had won again. "I mean, come on," he continued, gesturing vaguely with one hand as he reached for his steak knife with the other, casually cutting into his meal like he wasn't in the middle of belittling his own sister in front of their entire family. "You're what, managing schedules? Taking notes in meetings? Running little errands for people who actually make the big decisions?" The way he said it, the way he practically sneered the words "actually make the big decisions," sent a slow, simmering heat through Olivia's veins, not the kind that came from anger, not anymore, but something sharper, something colder. Something that tasted an awful lot like anticipation. She took a small sip of her wine, savoring the way Ryan's confidence practically radiated off of him, completely unaware that the ground beneath him was about to shift in ways he never could have predicted. Setting her glass down with deliberate care, she reached into her bag, feeling the smooth edges of the small, rectangular object between her fingers as she pulled it free, holding it lightly between her thumb and index finger before sliding it across the table. Her expression calm, almost pleasant, as she tilted her head slightly. "Tell that to the board of directors," she said, her voice steady, unwavering, laced with the kind of quiet satisfaction that sent a slow ripple of unease across Ryan's features. "I just bought the company you applied to last week." The words landed like a hammer against stone, shattering the false sense of ease that Ryan had spent the entire evening building, sending a ripple of stunned silence across the table as the meaning of what she had just said sank into every single person sitting there. Olivia didn't look away, didn't blink, didn't move as she watched Ryan's smirk falter, watched his fingers tighten around the handle of his knife, watched the way his jaw clenched just slightly, his throat bobbing as he swallowed hard. His brain clearly struggling to process the information that had just been dropped directly into his lap like an unavoidable truth he couldn't escape. Their father, usually so composed, so indifferent to the small battles between his children, finally set his drink down with a quiet, deliberate motion, his eyebrows knitting together as he turned his gaze toward Olivia. His voice breaking the silence with something that almost sounded like disbelief. "Wait. You what?" Ryan's fork slipped from his hand, clattering against the plate with a sharp, metallic ring that echoed through the room, the only sound cutting through the stunned silence that followed. And for the first time in her life, Olivia watched as her brother, the golden child, the family's shining star, the one who had always assumed he was untouchable, finally understood what it felt like to lose. The silence that followed my words stretched out longer than I expected, thick and weighty, pressing down on the table like an invisible force no one knew how to break. I watched as Ryan's smirk dissolved, his jaw tightening, his fingers curling against the table's edge as his mind worked overtime to process what I had just said, as if he could will the meaning of my words into something less devastating, something easier to swallow. His normally tanned complexion had paled slightly, his knuckles white where they rested on the linen tablecloth, his breathing just a little too controlled, too forced, like someone trying not to show how hard they had been hit. I didn't look away, didn't blink, didn't move a muscle as I let him sit with it, let him taste the unfamiliar bitterness of being blindsided, let him feel the weight of a reality that I had been quietly constructing for months, without him ever realizing it. For years, Ryan had enjoyed watching me shrink under his words, had taken pleasure in every moment he made me feel small, had never once imagined that I could, one day, be the person sitting across from him, delivering the kind of blow that could shake the very foundation he stood on. And yet, here we were. From across the table, my father, who had spent most of his life observing rather than intervening, who had always let Ryan speak without consequence, finally leaned forward. His brows furrowed as he stared at me with something I could only describe as genuine disbelief. He had never taken much interest in my career, had never bothered to ask what I did beyond vague, obligatory questions at holiday gatherings, had always assumed, much like Ryan, that I would never be the one who amounted to much of anything. But now, as he cleared his throat and placed his glass down with deliberate care, I could see the shift happening. The moment he realized that maybe, just maybe, he had been wrong about me all along. "Wait, you what?" he asked, his voice slower, measured, as if repeating the question would somehow make the answer change. I took my time, lifting my glass to my lips, savoring the rich, full-bodied taste of the wine as I watched the way my father's fingers twitched slightly against the table, his gaze darting between Ryan and me, as if struggling to reconcile the image of the daughter he had known with the one sitting in front of him now. I set my glass down carefully, exhaling a slow breath before offering the same words again, this time with a little more weight, a little more certainty, just to make sure everyone at this table understood exactly what had happened. "I bought the company Ryan applied to last week," I said, keeping my voice level, my expression composed, my hands resting lightly on the table as if this was nothing more than casual conversation. "I didn't just invest. I own it." Ryan blinked once, twice, his mouth opening slightly as if to say something, but no words came, no immediate, condescending retort, no effortless dismissal, no sharp, cutting remark that could make this moment disappear. He wasn't used to this, wasn't used to being caught off guard, wasn't used to being the one who had to sit there, exposed, vulnerable, with no way to twist the narrative back into his favor. "That's impossible," he finally said, his voice quieter than before, but still carrying that thread of disbelief, that desperate, grasping denial, as if saying it out loud would make it true. "You're lying." I tilted my head slightly, watching him the way a cat might watch a mouse trying to escape a trap it had walked into on its own. "Am I?" I asked, my voice light, almost amused, as I reached into my bag once more, this time pulling out a neatly folded document, sliding it across the table toward him with the same calm, deliberate motion as before. "Go ahead," I continued, gesturing toward it, my eyes never leaving his face. "Check for yourself." His hands were stiff as he reached for the paper, his movements jerky, hesitant, as if he already knew, deep down, that whatever was written inside would confirm the one thing he couldn't bring himself to accept. As his eyes scanned the first few lines, his entire body tensed, his shoulders locking, his throat bobbing as he swallowed hard, his grip tightening around the paper so forcefully that I almost thought he might rip it in half. The table was still silent, the tension suffocating, and for the first time in my life, I watched as Ryan struggled to find the words, struggled to regain the footing he had so carelessly lost. He had spent years walking through life with the certainty that he was untouchable, that no matter what he did, no matter how little effort he put in, success would always fall into his lap because that was how the world worked for him. But tonight, for the first time, he was realizing that wasn't true. How did you?" he started, his voice uneven, fractured, as he looked up at me, his expression no longer full of arrogance, but something closer to dread. I smiled then, slow and measured, leaning back in my chair as I allowed the moment to stretch just a little longer, allowed him to stew in the realization that I had not only won. I had seen this moment coming from miles away and had prepared for it with the kind of patience he never believed I was capable of. "Oh, I knew you applied," I said casually, reaching for my wine again, letting the words roll off my tongue with practiced ease. "I knew you were desperate for that job, that you needed it more than you let on, that behind all that talk about how set you were actually scrambling for an opportunity to prove yourself." I let that sink in before tilting my head, my voice dropping just slightly as I added, "And I knew, without a doubt, that the one thing you'd never see coming was me." Ryan's fingers curled around the edge of the document, his knuckles turning pale, his eyes darting toward our father as if waiting for some kind of intervention, some kind of reassurance, some kind of way out of the sinking pit he had just been shoved into. But our father only stared back at him, his expression unreadable, his silence heavier than anything else in the room. Ryan turned back to me then, his teeth clenched, his breath uneven, his entire body taut with restrained frustration. "Why?" he demanded, his voice sharp now, no longer carrying the false charm or lazy arrogance he had worn so easily before. "Why the hell would you do this?" I smiled wider this time, slow and deliberate, tapping my fingers lightly against the table as I met his gaze head-on. "Oh, trust me," I said, letting the words hang between us like a promise, like a challenge, like a warning. "I have my reasons." Ryan's face remained frozen in that perfect mix of shock and anger, his fingers clenched so tightly around the document in front of him that the edges had started to crumple beneath his grip, his knuckles stark white from the sheer force of his frustration. The air around us felt heavier now, charged with something deeper than just family tension, something more personal, more raw, more dangerous than the usual sibling bickering that had defined our relationship for as long as I could remember. His chest rose and fell with uneven breaths, his nostrils flaring slightly, his entire body tense with barely contained fury as he stared at me across the table, his jaw working as though he was trying to grind his words into something less bitter before spitting them out. "You think this is funny, don't you?" he finally said, his voice lower now, strained, as though he was fighting to keep himself from completely losing it in the middle of a crowded restaurant. "You really think you've pulled off something clever, screwing me over like this, humiliating me in front of our family, making some big, dramatic spectacle just so you can feel powerful for once in your life?" He let out a sharp, humorless laugh, shaking his head, his lips curling into something that was meant to be a smirk but fell just a little too flat to be convincing. "God, Olivia, you're pathetic." I exhaled slowly, tilting my head slightly as I studied him, watching the way his hands twitched, the way his fingers flexed against the table as though he wanted nothing more than to flip it over and storm out. The way his eyes burned with the same arrogance he had always worn like armor, as though refusing to acknowledge his loss could somehow undo it. Pathetic, I repeated, my voice lighter, almost amused, letting the word roll off my tongue as I tapped my nails against my wine glass. You know what's actually pathetic, Ryan? I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on the table, watching as his jaw tightened even further, as his hands curled into tighter fists. Spending years sabotaging someone just because you were afraid they might actually be better than you. His expression faltered for a fraction of a second, just the briefest flicker of uncertainty flashing across his features before he masked it with more anger, more bravado, more of the same cocky confidence that had always been his go-to defense mechanism. What the hell are you even talking about? He scoffed, shaking his head as though the mere suggestion was laughable, as though I had no idea what I was saying. As though I was some irrational little girl throwing a tantrum instead of the person who had just completely dismantled his entire career in a single calculated move. You really think I've wasted any time worrying about you? Don't flatter yourself, Olivia. I smiled then, slow and sharp, the kind of smile that wasn't meant to be comforting, the kind that sent a cold ripple of realization through him before I even had to say another word. Oh, I know you have, I said, my voice quiet but firm, filled with an unshakable certainty that made the tension at the table spike even higher. Because I was always the one person you could never quite outrun, the one person who actually earned the things you thought you deserved, the one person you knew could destroy that perfect little illusion of yours if I was ever given half a chance. I paused, letting that sink in before sitting back in my chair, my fingers tracing the rim of my glass as I watched his face carefully. And I think we both know, Ryan, that if you hadn't spent so much time trying to keep me down, you wouldn't be sitting here right now, staring at a piece of paper that proves I've finally beaten you at your own game. His breathing hitched slightly, his entire body going still for just a moment before he scoffed again, louder this time, more forced, shaking his head like he was trying to shake off the weight of my words. Oh, please, he said, rolling his eyes as though this conversation was beneath him, as though he wasn't unraveling right in front of me. You're acting like you did something impressive when all you really did was pull some petty, vindictive, pathetic stunt to try and make me look bad. He gestured wildly at the document still sitting on the table, his voice rising slightly, his frustration bleeding through every syllable. You bought a company out of spite, Olivia. Congratulations, you've officially outdone yourself in proving how insanely childish you still are. I raised an eyebrow, watching as he threw his little tantrum, as he tried to make me the irrational one, as he clung desperately to the idea that he was still in control of the narrative when every single person at this table, especially him, knew that wasn't the case anymore. Oh, no, Ryan, I said, shaking my head slowly, my smirk widening as I rested my chin in my palm. You don't get it yet, do you? I tilted my head slightly, lowering my voice just enough that he had to lean in to hear me, just enough to make him feel like I was about to reveal something he really didn't want to know. I didn't just buy the company, I whispered, savoring the way his expression darkened, the way his fingers twitched slightly against the table. I personally ensured that your rejection letter was signed, sealed, and delivered before you even walked into that interview. His face fell completely then, the blood draining from his skin so fast that for a second, I almost thought he might actually pass out right there in his chair. His hands clenched into tight fists against the table, his entire body rigid, his chest rising and falling with sharp, shallow breaths as the weight of what I had just said sank in. As the realization that I had personally made sure he failed hit him like a freight train. Mad that someone finally played the game better than you? I asked, raising an eyebrow, my voice dripping with amusement, with satisfaction, with the kind of quiet triumph that only comes after years of waiting for a moment like this. For the first time all night, Ryan had nothing to say. And then, just when I thought the moment couldn't get any better, just when I was about to sit back and fully enjoy the stunned silence stretching across the table, our mother, who had remained quiet throughout the entire exchange, finally spoke, her voice soft but firm, her words cutting through the tension like a blade. Olivia, she said, her eyes settling on me with something I couldn't quite decipher. If this is about what happened years ago, you need to let it go. I turned to her slowly, my expression unreadable, my fingers tightening slightly against the stem of my glass as something cold and sharp settled in my chest. "Oh," I said, my voice lower now, my tone shifting, darkening, taking on an edge that even I hadn't expected. "I haven't even started." The tension at the table was thick enough to choke on, stretching between us like an invisible rope wound so tightly that one wrong move might snap it in half. My mother's words still lingered in the air, her quiet plea for me to let the past go hanging there like an unanswered question, like a challenge she already knew I wouldn't accept. Across from me, Ryan's expression had hardened into something I had never quite seen before, a strange mixture of simmering rage and barely concealed panic, as though he was only just beginning to realize the depth of the hole he had been standing in this entire time. His hands were still clenched into tight fists against the table, his breathing shallow, his pulse visible in the sharp line of his throat, but for the first time in my entire life, he looked uncertain. I let the silence stretch, let it settle over us, let it sink in before I finally leaned forward, pressing my elbows lightly against the edge of the table, my fingers lacing together as I rested my chin on top of them. "You're really struggling with this, aren't you?" I murmured, my voice soft, almost gentle, but carrying just enough of an edge to make sure he knew exactly what I meant. The idea that I could have been building something all these years while you were too busy convincing yourself I was a failure. I tilted my head slightly, watching the flicker of something dangerous pass behind his eyes, watching the way his shoulders locked even tighter. "Tell me, Ryan," I continued, lowering my voice just slightly, savoring the way he stiffened at the sound. "How does it feel knowing that your entire future now rests in my hands?" His jaw clenched so tightly that I could almost hear the grind of his teeth, his knuckles white against the tablecloth as he fought to maintain whatever scraps of composure he had left. "You don't know what the hell you're talking about," he finally snapped, his voice sharp, biting, laced with a desperate kind of anger that told me exactly how much I had already rattled him. "You bought one company out of spite, Olivia. Congratulations, you had your little moment, you got your revenge, but let's not act like you're suddenly some kind of—" I laughed then, cutting him off mid-sentence, the sound light, easy, completely unaffected by the frustration bleeding through his words. "Oh, Ryan," I sighed, shaking my head, the amusement still lacing my voice as I reached for my wine glass and took a slow, deliberate sip. "You really think this was just about embarrassing you?" I set the glass back down carefully, my fingers tracing the rim for a moment before I met his gaze again, my expression shifting into something sharper, something colder, something that finally made the first real flicker of doubt appear in his eyes. "You still don't get it, do you?" I could see the war happening behind his eyes, the desperate need to maintain control clashing violently with the sinking realization that he no longer had any. He was scrambling, trying to convince himself that this was nothing more than a power play, a stunt, a fleeting moment of triumph that I couldn't possibly sustain. But the problem with Ryan was that he had spent so long dismissing me that he had never once considered the possibility that I might have been planning this for a lot longer than he realized. I leaned forward just slightly, lowering my voice to a near whisper, my lips curving into something that wasn't quite a smile, but held just enough satisfaction to make his fingers twitch against the table. "I didn't just buy the company you applied to," I murmured, watching the way his shoulders tensed, the way his throat bobbed with a sharp swallow, the way his breath hitched ever so slightly. "I bought controlling shares in Baxter Holdings 3 months ago." His entire body went still, his fingers flexing against the table, his chest rising and falling in sharp, uneven breaths, but he said nothing, and for a moment, the only sound was the distant clatter of dishes from the kitchen, the faint murmur of other conversations happening around us, the soft hum of background music that now felt completely disconnected from the scene unfolding in front of me. And then, finally, his voice low, quiet, filled with something that was no longer just frustration, but something closer to fear. "You're lying," he whispered, but there was no confidence in it, no certainty, nothing but the desperate need to convince himself that what I had just said couldn't possibly be true. I tilted my head slightly, tapping my fingers against the table, my smile widening just enough to make sure he felt the truth before I even said the words. Am I? I asked, raising an eyebrow, watching as his hands trembled just slightly against the linen. Because last time I checked, Baxter Holdings has a controlling stake in Brentford International. I let that sit for a moment, let him catch up, let him realize. And remind me, Ryan, isn't that the company you work for? The color drained from his face so fast that for a second, I genuinely thought he might be sick, his fingers curling so tightly into fists that his nails were digging into his palms, his breathing short and sharp as the pieces finally fell into place. I had everything. I had control over the job he had spent years trying to climb through. I had control over the company he had staked his entire career on. I had turned every single opportunity he had ever taken for granted into something that I now owned. And for the first time in his life, Ryan finally understood what it felt like to be powerless. His chair scraped against the floor as he suddenly shoved back from the table, his movements jerky, frantic, filled with barely contained rage as he threw his napkin down and shot to his feet. His breaths coming hard and fast as his hands clenched into fists at his sides. You bitch, he seethed, his voice shaking, his entire body radiating fury, frustration, helplessness, and something so deeply unfamiliar to him that he didn't know what to do with it. You think this is funny? You think ruining my life is some kind of game? I watched him for a long moment, letting the weight of his anger crash against me, letting him feel how completely and utterly he had lost, letting him realize that no matter what he did now, no matter how many words he spat at me, no matter how much he tried to claw his way out of this moment, there was nothing he could do to undo what had already been done. And then, just as he turned toward the door, just as he started to storm away, just as he thought he could still walk out of here with even 1 ounce of dignity left, I let my final move drop. Oh, you didn't know? I called out, my voice dripping with amusement, watching as he froze mid-step, his shoulders locking up, his entire body going rigid. I leaned back, lifting my wine glass once more, my smirk widening as I delivered the final blow. Dad was planning to invest in your company next quarter, I said, pausing just long enough for the realization to sink in before finishing, my voice soft, easy, filled with victory. But, well, I own that now, too. The moment my final words left my lips, the entire restaurant seemed to fade into the background. The hum of distant conversations and the clinking of silverware against plates becoming nothing more than a dull murmur beneath the sheer weight of what had just happened. Ryan stood there, frozen mid-step, his entire body locked in place as if his mind refused to accept the reality that had been laid out before him, his shoulders rigid, his breathing sharp, his hands clenched so tightly into fists that his knuckles had turned stark white. For years, he had been the one holding the cards, the one controlling every narrative, the one walking through life with the kind of effortless confidence that only came from never having to experience real consequences, and yet now, in the space of a single evening, everything had shifted, everything had changed, everything he had ever taken for granted had been ripped from his grasp without warning. I could see it in the way his throat bobbed as he swallowed hard, in the way his jaw tightened, in the way his fingers twitched as if resisting the urge to lash out, to throw something, to say something that might somehow undo the destruction already set in motion. But there was nothing left to say. Slowly, Ryan turned, his expression caught somewhere between fury and disbelief, his mouth opening slightly as if to speak, but no words came, no sharp retort, no attempt at a comeback. Nothing but the widening of his eyes as the full weight of his loss came crashing down on him. Across the table, our father sat completely still, his gaze shifting between us, his usually indifferent expression now tinged with something that looked dangerously close to recognition, as though he was only just now realizing that the balance of power had shifted right before his eyes. He had spent years watching Ryan dominate every conversation, allowing him to mock and belittle me without consequence, dismissing every insult as playful sibling rivalry, never once interfering. Never once acknowledging that the scales had always been tipped in Ryan's favor. But now, for the first time, I saw the exact moment he understood that the dynamic had changed permanently, that Ryan was no longer the one in control, that I had become something he had never anticipated, a true contender, a real threat, an opponent who had already won before the game even began. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating, before Ryan let out a sharp, uneven breath, his fingers twitching against his sides as he took a slow step forward, his voice lower now, strained, barely holding itself together. You think this makes you better than me?" he asked, his words uneven, his tone laced with something almost desperate, as though clinging to whatever scraps of superiority he had left. "You think ruining my life means you've won?" I exhaled slowly, watching him for a long moment, letting the weight of his words settle between us, letting him sit with the bitter taste of his own downfall before finally tilting my head slightly, my lips curving into something just shy of a smile. "Ryan," I murmured, my voice quiet, steady, unshaken. "I didn't just win." I leaned forward slightly, letting the words sink in, watching the way his entire body tensed as I delivered the final blow. "I made sure you lost." His jaw clenched, his breath hitching slightly, his shoulders rising and falling in sharp, uneven motions as if he were struggling to keep himself from completely losing it right here in the middle of the restaurant. But it didn't matter. Because there was no coming back from this, no clever way out, no final move he could make that would change the outcome. The game was over, the board was cleared, and he had nothing left to play. I reached for my napkin, dabbing lightly at the corner of my mouth before smoothing out the fabric of my dress, my movements calm, controlled, composed, before finally pushing back my chair and rising to my feet. "Well," I sighed, adjusting the strap of my purse over my shoulder, glancing briefly at the stunned expressions still lingering on both Ryan's and my father's faces. "I think that about wraps things up, don't you?" Ryan didn't answer, didn't move, didn't even blink as he stood there, shoulders locked, fingers twitching, face unreadable beneath the storm of emotions brewing behind his eyes. With one final glance toward the table, I turned on my heel, my heels clicking softly against the polished floor as I strode toward the exit, not bothering to look back, not sparing him another second of my attention, because the truth was, Ryan had never mattered as much as he thought he did, not in my world, not in my success, not in the empire I had spent years quietly building while he was too busy believing I would never be anything more than a footnote in his story. As I stepped outside, the cool evening air wrapping around me like a quiet exhale, my phone buzzed in my hand, the screen lighting up with a single message from a number I knew all too well. "Welcome to your new empire." I let out a slow breath, my fingers tightening around the device for just a moment before slipping it back into my bag, my steps lighter than they had been in years, my heart steady, my mind clear, my future mine at last. And as I walked away, leaving behind the past, leaving behind the expectations, leaving behind every single moment that had ever made me doubt my own worth, I couldn't help but wonder, what would you do if you finally had power over the people who wronged you? Because I had my answer. And I had never felt freer.